The Vatican has announced the death of Pope Francis. He died at his residence in Casa Santa Marta this morning after a recent period of illness. He was 88. He was the first Latin American leader of the Roman Catholic Church. Today, thousands of pilgrims flocked to St. Peter's Square in Rome to join the outpouring of sadness from Catholics around the world.
Cari fratelli e sorelle.
A special blessing delivered in his final hours. This was the last public appearance of Pope Francis, wishing the world happy Easter yesterday from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. Then, this morning, the solemn announcement of his passing.
Con profondo dolore.
It is with profound sadness I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and His Church.
In Rome and around the world, the news has prompted an outpouring of sadness.
To be honest, I had to take a minute. It was quite emotional because I really liked him as a pope personally. He had a genuine care for the poor.
When he came home from hospital, we could feel that he was no longer what he was. We will miss him.
World leaders too have been paying tribute to Pope Francis. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni described him as a great man and a great pastor, while US Vice President J.D. Vance, who briefly met the pontiff in Rome yesterday, said his heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world. At Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral, the bells tolled following news of the Pope's death, as French President Emmanuel Macron added to the chorus of condolences.
Throughout his time as Pope, he has been at the side of the most vulnerable, the most fragile, with a great deal of humility.
Those comments echoing the sense of grief felt by so many around the world today following the death of Pope Francis. Kate Varley, RTE News.
President Michael D. Higgins has led Irish tributes to Pope Francis, saying there was a warmth to the Pope who brought a unique humility to the role. He said that Pope Francis was vocal on the vital issues of our time, including global hunger, poverty, climate change and justice. Both the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, and the Sinn Féin leader, Mary Lou MacDonald, have also paid tribute.
I think the people of Ireland and indeed the people of the world valued his leadership, his humility. He was a voice for the voiceless, the marginalised, the poor, the migrants. And in a world which is turbulent and where there has been shocking conflict, I think he was a very pure voice of love and mercy, and he got the fundamentals right in terms of urging people to cease conflict, to cease war, and he promoted peace.
I think it's fair to say that he was a pope with a very developed and a very broad worldview, and he was all about progress, he was about equality, he was about inclusion, and he stood resolutely with the poor of this world. I suppose much of that is attributable to his Latin American roots. He stood also with the people of Palestine, and he was never ever afraid to speak truth to power.
The leaders of the Catholic Church in Ireland have paid tribute to Pope Francis for continuing to perform his duties despite serious illnesses. The Archbishops of Armagh and Dublin also held a joint prayer service this afternoon with parishioners in Armagh Cathedral as they signed a book of condolence.
With papal flags at half-mast, the bells of St Patrick's Cathedral in Armagh rang 88 times, one for each year in the life of Pope Francis. The leaders of the Catholic Church in Ireland then paid warm tribute to a pontiff who continued in his role despite serious illness.
It came very abruptly and very suddenly at the end, but perhaps the way he would have wanted it. He would have liked to have died, I think, with his boots on, and he certainly did that. He appeared, as you know, yesterday on the balcony in St. Peter's Square.
His final words to the people yesterday were Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, blessing the people. So it was very beautiful, and in some ways, for me, it shows that this is probably the way that Pope Francis would have wanted to go.
The Archbishops of Armagh and Dublin then held an informal prayer service with parishioners waiting to sign a book of condolence.
Regina Caeli, laetare, alleluia.
A wonderful occasion, but a very sad occasion. I actually woke this morning to the news with a tear in my eye.
It's very hard to believe. It's a very sad day, and he'll be greatly missed. God rest him.
Lynette McSheen and her family were in the crowd when Pope Francis said Mass when he visited Ireland for the World Meeting of Families in 2018.
We just felt that on Easter Monday we would take away skate across and offer some prayers for his soul, offer the rosary on the way over, and then come into the cathedral here to say a prayer for him as well.
A couple returning home to Mullingar after a weekend in Belfast visited the cathedral to pay their respects.
We had seen him on TV and social media yesterday, out and about and meeting the people. And he seems so determined, I'd say, to get home from hospital, be amongst his people and go at the time that he felt was right for him.
His strength was his humility, really. You know, that's what I felt about the man, yeah. So he'll be a loss to the Catholic Church and to the people of the world.
Vincent Kearney, RTÉ News, Armagh.
Pope Francis paid a visit to Knock Shrine in County Mayo during his two-day visit to Ireland in 2018. Parishioners and visitors have been speaking about the passing of the pontiff and what he meant to them.
The parish church in Knock was packed for 3 o'clock Mass, with prayers offered for the soul of Pope Francis. Nearby in the Apparition Chapel, a mourning scarf was draped over a photograph of the pontiff. This is where he came to pray during his visit to Knock in 2018.
Came inside, and then just briefly then we had a moment's prayer, about a minute prayer, silence. A bell rang and everybody just went absolutely silent. It was an extraordinary moment.
As people came here to pray for their own private intentions, the news of the passing of Pope Francis made the visit more poignant for some.
This year is the year of hope, which we all need. And he was a very clever man and spoke very well and touched all our hearts very much. So we'll miss him.
The Pope was more human because we could relate to him better, you know, of all the popes, and he was more vocal, he was more interactive than all the popes we can remember. So I found him pretty cool.
I seen him in Croke Park in 2018, and he was a very nice man, and I was very sad to see him pass away.
People say Pope Francis was a liberal pope. Others say he was very conservative.
Yeah, I would say that he was orthodox, and he believed in what the church believed and what the church teaches to be true and good and beautiful.
Yeah, liberal and conservative are secular labels. You know, it's very easy to try and somebody's life up in a few words, but he was much more than that. He was very relevant for today, I think.
Teresa Mannion, RTÉ News, Knock, County Mayo.
Pope Francis was elected in March 2013, becoming the 266th Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Our religion and social affairs correspondent Alva Keneally has been looking back at the life of Pope Francis.
Buonasera.
From the outset, he was Francis the Informal, asking those who cheered his election to bless him before he blessed them. Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio called himself after the radical St. Francis, serving notice that reforms were in store. He rejected the traditional lavish papal apartment and appointed a council of 8 cardinals from around the globe to restructure the Vatican administration and tackle corruption. They began by closing questionable accounts in the Vatican Bank. He broke new ground by establishing a commission on child protection which included survivor advocates like the Irishwoman Mary Collins, but she resigned 3 years later over a failure by a Vatican department to comply with a recommendation that all correspondence from victims and survivors should receive a response. On his first trip outside of Rome, Pope Francis visited Lampedusa as the migrant crisis swept across the Mediterranean. And he horrified traditionalists by washing the feet of women and Muslims during his first Holy Week ceremony as Pope. When asked about homosexuality at the beginning of his papacy, he said, "Who am I to judge?" He later approved blessings for same-sex couples and signed a Doctrine Office document allowing transgender people to be baptised and serve as godparents. But in latter years, he had to apologise for using extremely derogatory language about gay men. Many highlighted his closeness to the poor, whether it was in developed countries, in the Third World, or where the two meet, for example in refugee camps in Greece. His appointments of bishops and cardinals favoured both developing nations and newer perspectives, promoting many people from the margins despite the tightly regimented hierarchy handed down to him by his predecessors. His teaching document on the environment, Laudato Si', influenced the World Climate Summit in Paris in 2015, calling on the human family to defend Mother Earth. In the summer of 2018, he visited Ireland as part of the World Meeting of Families, where he was confronted with the controversy surrounding mother and baby homes. He said he hoped his visit would help grow unity and reconciliation among Christians on the island of Ireland. During a mass in the Phoenix Park, he asked for forgiveness. 2 years later, as the world grappled with the impact of COVID-19, places of worship worldwide were forced to close, including Catholic churches. Pope Francis used the global pandemic to reiterate the central message of his papacy, calling for an end to the pandemic of poverty worldwide. He also announced a synod on synodality in the Catholic Church, offering Catholics worldwide a say in the nature and future of their church. It resulted in proposals for church renewal, including the expansion of women's leadership roles, greater lay participation in decision-making and structural reforms. In March 2021, at the age of 84, the pontiff made an unprecedented visit to Iraq under tight security in an effort to offer hope to Iraq's minority Christian community. In one of the most significant moments of the trip, Pope Francis met Iraq's Shia leader, the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. On a visit to Canada in 2022, Pope Francis apologised to Indigenous communities for the abuse they suffered at residential Catholic schools, which were in existence from the late 1800s to the 1990s. He used a wheelchair due to strained knee ligaments and acknowledged that his week-long Canadian pilgrimage was a test that showed he needed to slow down and one day possibly retire. The Pope's predecessor, Emeritus Pope Benedict, opened a path to resignation and remained on Vatican grounds until he passed away on New Year's Eve in 2022. Pope Francis presided over the funeral in a unique ceremony which was carefully organised by the Vatican. As wars raged in Ukraine and Gaza, Pope Francis continuously called for peace. And the year 2025 marked a jubilee year for the Catholic Church, the Jubilee of Hope. In February, the Pope wrote to US bishops to express his condemnation of mass deportations by the Trump administration, calling on those bishops to walk together to defend the human dignity of the migrants in their country. In his effort to reform the social and economic policies of the Vatican, Pope Francis had his critics. But he was greatly admired by people of all faiths worldwide. A man of the people, he'll be remembered for his courage, his compassion and his humility.
And Alva joins us now in studio. We're also joined from Rome by Father Martin Brown, Benedictine monk who currently works in the Vatican for the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity. Father Brown, good evening. Thank you indeed for joining us. Obviously, like everyone, you heard this news this morning. What has the reaction in Rome been?
Well, I suppose like everywhere else, it has been shock. Obviously, we've known for quite a while that the Pope is unwell, but we had not expected this would happen. As we all saw him yesterday, delivering the Urbi et Orbi greeting, and at various points over the previous week, appearing briefly at a number of ceremonies. In fact, I was at the Palm Sunday Mass and was very close to him when he passed in front of where I was sitting with an ecumenical guest. So yeah, everybody is very surprised, even though we knew he was very ill. It's still quite a surprise.
Indeed. Now, from your own work in the Vatican, particularly on ecumenical matters, what do you think Pope Francis's legacy will be?
Well, one of the words Pope Francis often used in all kinds of contexts, not just the ecumenical one, is encounter. This has been a sort of a leading motif in his time as Pope, very committed to to encounter with the other, to working with others. So whether that was with other Christians, with other religions, with culture, that very much was how he looked at the world, and I saw that very closely when I would sometimes be bringing ecumenical guests to see him. He wanted to know about their context, their place. He wanted to emphasize what they had in common. He spoke all the time about walking together, working together, and praying together. And so that allowed him to be loved and accepted, and to exercise a really significant kind of leadership, even outside the visible bounds of the Catholic Church. And the messages I've been receiving today from ecumenical partners all around the world have been quite a testimony to that.
Now, as you say, you have worked closely with him, you have met him on numerous occasions, most recently on Palm Sunday. How will you remember him as a man?
Yeah, I think his face, and of course we've been looking a lot at his face while he was ill, but he had quite a serious face, but when he would meet somebody, his face would be transformed, his face would light up, and that's how I certainly will remember the man. This huge warmth, this capacity to engage with people from all kinds of traditions, all kinds of contexts, without necessarily being able to speak their language. He could communicate just by his very warm humanity, and that is certainly a memory that I will hold.
OK, Father Martin Brown in Rome, thank you indeed for joining us on 6-1. And as I say, we're also joined by our religious affairs correspondent, Alva Keneally. Alva, we don't know yet when the funeral will be. I think it's likely to be Friday, Saturday, possibly. But plans are already in place, and plans that were prepared by Francis himself.
Absolutely. And OK, we need confirmation, full confirmation from the Vatican on all of this. But it is expected that he will lie in state from Wednesday at St. Peter's Basilica, and that normally public can view the body for 3 days. That's the normal way that Pope lies in state. And then it's expected that the funeral will be at the weekend, quite a possibility that will be on Saturday. And in terms of that funeral, for the burial, he's going to be brought around to Sancta Maria Maggiore Basilica. Now, that's a basilica that Francis got great solace out of. He prayed a lot there, reflected there, but it's also 5 kilometres from St. Peter's Basilica. So the logistics in terms of bringing him around from St. Peter's Basilica around to Santa Maria Maggiore is probably significant, because they're going to have to be road closures. They're going to have to work their way around this. I did speak to someone in Rome this afternoon who said that all police have not been given, basically their annual leave has been taken off them. They can't go on holidays now. So that's an indication as well that security for this is going to be extremely tight. Bear in mind all the world leaders that will be attending.
And obviously after the funeral, after the goodbye to Pope Francis, there is the whole business of the conclave. Yeah, I mean, the conclave takes place usually like 15 to 20 days after the Pope dies. Now, that is fluid, and a new Pope is elected. Those who will be electing have to be under the age of 80. But bear in mind, the majority of the cardinal electors, they've been chosen by Francis, so therefore they largely reflect his vision and of a more inclusive church. I think it's fair to say there has been eyes on who will be the next successor for the last maybe 6 months, but particularly as Francis got ill. But I think the focus of many people at the moment is really on the man who showed such determination yesterday at St. Peter's Basilica, coming out on that balcony and blessing people, and the legacy that he leaves in his wake. OK, Alva Keneally, social and religious affairs correspondent, thanks indeed for that.
Now, Pope Francis visited Ireland in August 2018 as part of the World Meeting of Families. During his 2-day visit, the Pontiff met the President and Taoiseach. He visited Knock Shrine and celebrated Mass at the Papal Cross in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. Our correspondent, Mark O'Driscoll, looks back on his visit here.
It was the first visit by a reigning pontiff to Ireland since 1979. But for Pope Francis, it was a return journey. As a priest, he had come to study English here in 1980. His first visit as Pope followed an invitation to attend the World Meeting of Families, so it was not a formal state visit as such. His first stop after Dublin Airport, however, was Áras an Uachtaráin, where he had a private visit with President Michael D. Higgins, before travelling to Dublin Castle, where he was warmly welcomed by Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, who went on to speak of a shared history of sorrow and shame.
Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, industrial schools, illegal adoptions and clerical child abuse.
The Pope addressed the Church's handling of clerical child sex abuse in his response.
The failure of ecclesiastical authorities, bishops, religious superiors, priests, and others adequately to address these repellent crimes has rightly given rise to outrage.
Clerical child sex abuse was an issue which would be a recurring theme on his 2-day visit, but Pope Francis did meet privately with some survivors of abuse, and he went to the Pro-Cathedral, where he sat in silent prayer at the perpetual candle to victims of clerical sex abuse. While protests were a reminder of this and other deeply felt issues, there was also scenes of joy as people lined the streets to see the Pontiff in his popemobile in Dublin city centre.
Hallelujah, we're going to see the Pope.
So we just took our hands and said a prayer, and I just started crying with my nerves and everything. It was just amazing.
The Pope spent some time at the Capuchin Day Centre, and his day concluded at one of the key events of his visit, the Festival of Families gathering in Croke Park, described as a musical celebration of family and to remind people about those who are struggling, particularly migrants and refugees. The second day of his visit saw Pope Francis arrive at Ireland West Airport. The weather wasn't kind, but it didn't stop around 45,000 people gathering at Knock Shrine to see him.
It's great for our Monsignor Horan up in heaven there to finally get his wish to come true for the Pope to land in Knock.
He spoke to them about the importance of family prayer, reconciliation in the north, and again the issue of clerical abuse.
None of us can fail to be moved by the stories of young people who suffered abuse.
Back in Dublin, the Pope's final public engagement was in Phoenix Park to celebrate a papal mass, the high point of his short trip to Ireland. 500,000 tickets had been issued, but far fewer turned up to the Mass, where the Pope acknowledged the pain and damage caused by the church hierarchy, who had sought to cover up abuses, and asked for forgiveness. It was a short trip. Pope Francis was in Ireland for just 32 hours. After a final meeting with Irish bishops, he waved goodbye before boarding his plane home. Mark O'Driscoll, RTE News.
A little earlier, I spoke to former President and canon law expert Mary McAleese, and I started by asking her what stood out in terms of Pope Francis's voice on many issues.
Well, he worked essentially in two worlds, or on two planes. One was internally within the church and the church's teaching. The other was the voice that he had, the big, strong, moral voice, the conscience of the world, where he spoke out from what is effectively the pulpit of the world. After all, it is the biggest NGO in the world, the Catholic Church, the only faith system with permanent representative status in the United Nations, the biggest Christian denomination. So, with a membership of 1.4 billion people. So a key influencer in the world. And when he speaks, people listen. They don't always do what he asks, but they do listen. And so his voice, speaking out to the world, was very strong. We think of how he went to Lampedusa to show great sympathy and compassion for those who were being washed up on its shores. We think of that beautiful little child washed up dead on the shores, little immigrant child, parents, people just looking for a chance in life. And of course, anybody who has read his recent memoir, Hope, will realise he comes from a strongly immigrant tradition. His people immigrated in tough times from Italy to Argentina. So he identified strongly with immigrants, a very big topic of our time. You could reduce really everything he said out to the world to two things: the sacredness of the human person, every human person, and the sacredness of the earth. And if we got those two things right and in right relationship and honoured our responsibilities to both, in his view, the world would be an awful lot better place. That's the message. Unfortunately, and he was good at that, and I think that he garnered a lot of personal respect, a lot of love for that. People like to hear his voice, particularly in a world where we hear much more strident and rather ugly voices today, particularly in the field of global politics. And he spoke to them too, quite emphatically. He didn't ever water down his views. But internally, he inherited what I might call an existential crisis in the church. It wasn't of his making, and he didn't resolve it by the time he died. because it was just too big a job, I think, for the time span, and indeed for the person. But internally within the church, the mess that he inherited, the huge mess that he inherited, that is still on the desk of whoever succeeds him. And he tried in a number of ways to ameliorate it. Probably, I think the jury is still out on the level of success.
And you speak there of the changes he tried to make with the church, but also the determination and bravery that he showed, because despite the ill health of recent times, he was very determined to partake in the Easter service yesterday. We saw how fragile he was, but he met with people, he arrived out onto the balcony and bringing a great sense of joy to a lot of people.
I am firmly of the belief from yesterday when I saw him and the balcony curtains coming back and hearing the weakness of the little voice with the Buona Pasqua, remembering back to the day whenever in 2013 when he said Buona Sera, tall, strong, a big man with a booming voice, now reduced to this man in a wheelchair, quiet, suffering. And we saw even when he tried to raise his hands, the weakness, he had barely enough strength to lift the hand in blessing. That man yesterday emphatically knew he was dying, that his death was imminent, and that he was going to use the last breath in his body to be the pastor he was elected to be, and that he chose to be the day he became a priest. And I think that's his great legacy in some ways, is just that message from yesterday. Everything else is still like a kind of a leaven that may or may not rise in the church. But yesterday was, I thought, a formidable exhibition of witness to belief in the power of love and the power of the resurrection.
Well, I'm joined now in the studio by the former Archbishop of Dublin, Diarmuid Martin. Good evening, Archbishop. Thank you very much for joining us. Like the rest of the world, you heard the news this morning. What was your immediate reaction when you heard that the Pope had passed?
Shock to me, because everybody knew he was quite ill, but the impression was he was getting better. And nobody was expecting such a sudden death. I had a fair amount of contact with him, also on a personal level. He was always extremely kind and thoughtful in talking to me. I remember on one occasion he stopped me and said, I often think of you, he said, because you got a hard job in Dublin and you must have gone to bed many a night and said, why didn't I stay in Geneva? Which was, But I mean, a lot of people are remembering his kindness, his thoughtfulness, his talk on mercy. He was a strong man, however. He when he wanted to do something, he did it. And he was his own man. He was in nobody's pocket. And I think that was one of his great strengths, which shouldn't be underestimated.
And he needed that strength.
He did. President McAleese said to me the other day that she met a group of seminarians from North America once in Rome, and she asked them, are they hopeful about the future of the church? And they said, we are very, very hopeful because we've got a great leader. And she said, Pope Francis said, no, President Trump. There are quite a lot of rather conservative thinking Canada who are frightened by this Pope because of the fact that he's free. I remember from coming to Dublin and the discussions there were about what was to be said in Dublin Castle. The thing that strikes me most of all is he met a group of survivors in the nunciature, and I met him half an hour later, and he said, I'm so shocked. I've rewritten the introduction for the Mass tomorrow morning myself. He did it in Spanish by hand, and I saw it. And he said, I remember about one man who was from a mother and baby home and had been told to ask about his birth parents would be a mortal sin. And the Pope wrote, it was not a mortal sin. It was the sixth commandment, love your parents. But he had this, and I've been trying to think all day is, the depth in him, where did it come from? His gentleness with people, this famous occasion in St. Peter's Square, where a man with a severely damaged face was in the crowd. He stopped the jeep, got out, went over, didn't say to the man who was accompanying this man, what happened to him. He kissed him. So there was this spontaneity in him which emerged. which came obviously from his deep faith. When he talked about mercy, he was really talking about God. In his final speech in Dublin to the Irish bishops, he said, remember that your church has got a history of being authoritarian and harsh. He didn't hide but he had this concept of mercy because he said God is mercy. God is merciful. And we had very often this very authoritarian church in Ireland which didn't reflect the real God.
Mm. You mentioned his strength, and you mentioned the fact that some people didn't like the direction he was taking the church in. Does his legacy, does the survival of the changes he set in motion, does that really depend on who his successor is?
Yes and no. I mean, the interesting thing is, most popes have nominated nearly all the cardinals who are the next elector. That's a question of just longevity. But they've never attempted to clone the previous pope. The cardinals will sit down with a certain freedom and look at the needs of the church today and build on what he has left as a legacy. And I think that they will. But they will also be different. When he was coming to Ireland, I said to him, you're coming to a country that's changing radically. And he said, I know that, I understand that. Yeah?
It's okay. Dermot Martin, former Archbishop of Dublin, thank you so much for joining us on 6-1. From the outset, Pope Francis made clear that his papacy would focus on simplicity, humility and synodality.
Fiona Mitchell looks back at his time as pontiff and the legacy that he leaves behind.
Unprecedented and many initially thought unworkable, the circumstances of Pope Francis' election had already sent shockwaves through the global church. Two popes with differing views and approaches, sharing space in the smallest country in the world, was a test which proved for many an indicator of Pope Francis' personality and skills.
Far from seeing Benedict living in the Vatican as an obstacle, he saw it as a tool, in a sense, he could use. He developed a very close and warm friendship with Pope Benedict, which I think surprised some people because, they're really coming from a radically different viewpoint of the church. Benedict said on numerous interviews that he felt very protected by Pope Francis. And yet, at the same time, Francis was able to chart a very different way forward. We associate with the papacy of Benedict, with regal vestments and a kind of formality that Pope Francis very, very quickly set aside. Right from the beginning, we saw he was wearing the black scuffed shoes rather than the red leather loafers that we'd been used to with Pope Benedict, setting aside the more traditional, more elaborate vestments to say, I'm setting a tone of simplicity here. And I think the important thing about the simplicity, that was not something rehearsed. This is just who he was.
Those differences were seen not just in a less formal approach, but also in the priorities which Pope Francis identified for his papacy.
He really wanted to focus on what he called the poor church for the poor. So I think certainly his attention towards the poor, the marginalized, migrants, any of the exploited, and also, he really made a big focal point of his papacy as well, the issue of climate change.
Alongside the Pope's social concerns were questions of church reforms on issues ranging from homosexuality to women priests.
The only predictable thing about Pope Francis is that he was often unpredictable, and he was a bit of a maverick to everybody, and I think Francis is somebody that did not fit into either of those molds. His pastoral approach, for example, to issues such as communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, he didn't offer a blanket open door, but he opened the door.
Some of the harshest criticism of Pope Francis surrounded his handling of the ongoing issue of clerical abuse.
He wasn't slow to, critique and denounce clerical abuse itself. I think he was slow to understand the nature of the cover-up, to understand the institutional forces that were at play. So the issue of clerical abuse remains an issue that his successor and probably successors after that will have to deal with.
That successor will be chosen in the Vatican in the weeks ahead. Fiona Mitchell, RTE News.